President Donald Trump is escalating his criticism of the news media, now calling for federal action against two major broadcast networks. In a pair of posts on his Truth Social platform, the president argued that NBC and ABC should have their broadcast licenses terminated for what he described as unfair coverage of Republicans and/or conservatives. He labeled the networks as two of the absolute worst and most biased in the world, and questioned why they are not paying millions of dollars in license fees. The president stated they should lose their licenses for their unfair coverage, but at a minimum, they should pay up big for having the privilege of using the most valuable airwaves anywhere at any time. He concluded by saying that crooked journalism should not be rewarded, it should be terminated. This confrontation with the media comes as the president is engaged in another escalating feud, this time with Maryland Governor Wes Moore. What began as a war of words over crime rates in Baltimore has now evolved into a high-stakes standoff with significant economic implications. The new flashpoint is the heavy machinery like tractors and bulldozers, as well as nearly all of America's tin imports and over a third of its nickel, both essential for electronics and batteries. A spokesperson for Governor Moore warned that threatening this funding would cause irrevocable damage to the national economy, and stressed that reconstruction is already underway. The feud has also seen President Trump decline an invitation from Moore to join a public safety walk in Baltimore, instead suggesting he might send in the National Guard to address crime, similar to the recent deployment in Washington, D.C. Governor Moore's office fired back, stating the president would rather attack his country's largest cities from behind a desk than walk the streets with the people he represents. The clash between the White House and Maryland is one of several high-stakes confrontations playing out between federal and state authorities. Another major battle is escalating over the future of the American auto market, with Texas now joining the Trump administration in its legal fight against California. The dispute centers on California's effort to implement its own strict vehicle emission standards, which would effectively ban the sale of new gasoline and diesel-powered cars in the state by 2035. The Trump administration and Congress recently revoked federal waivers that had allowed California to set rules tougher than the national baseline. In response, California Governor Gavin Newsom filed a lawsuit and issued an executive order to press ahead with the plan. Now Texas is formally intervening in the case. In a motion filed Friday, the state argues that California is attempting to unlawfully impose its radical agenda on the entire nation. Aided by the pro-Trump legal group America First Legal, Texas officials contend that because automakers typically produce a single lineup of vehicles for the entire country, California's strict regulations would dictate the requirements for all cars sold in the United States. They warn this would result in fewer choices for consumers, skyrocketing costs, and an America remade in California's image. The stakes are particularly high because 17 other states and the District of Columbia have already adopted California's standards. Together, these states represent 40% of the nation's light-duty vehicle market. The legal challenge has also drawn support from major business groups, including the American Free Enterprise Chamber of Commerce, which has sided with the Trump administration to block California's move. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, a high-profile congressional investigation is widening its scope. The House Oversight Committee has officially issued a subpoena to the estate of the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Committee Chairman James Comer is demanding a wide range of documents by September 8th, including Epstein's will, financial transaction records, call logs, and any document that could be considered a potential list of clients involved in his sex trafficking ring. The committee also announced it will hear from a key figure in the case, Alexander Acosta, the former labor secretary who, as a U.S. attorney in Florida, oversaw the controversial 2008 non-prosecution agreement with Epstein. Acosta is scheduled to appear for a closed-door interview on September the 19th. That 2008 deal has been widely criticized for allowing Epstein to avoid serious federal charges. He pleaded guilty to lesser state charges, served just 13 months in a county jail with work release privileges, and the agreement also shielded his co-conspirators from charges. The House investigation, which began with bipartisan support, is now showing signs of political strain. After former Attorney General Bill Barr testified last week, Democrats and Republicans offered conflicting accounts of his deposition. Democrats accused their GOP colleagues of asking insufficient questions, while Chairman Comer urged them not to politicize the probe. The division deepened over whether Barr's testimony cleared President Trump of any connection to Epstein, with the two parties releasing contradictory statements. And finally, shifting from Washington politics to the economy, there are new signals from the Federal Reserve that could soon impact the finances of millions of Americans. In his keynote address at the annual Jackson Hole Economic Symposium, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell indicated that an interest rate cut could be coming as soon as September. Powell stated that current conditions, particularly a deteriorating labor market, may warrant a change in monetary policy. In his prepared remarks, he said, "With policy in restrictive territory, the baseline outlook and the shifting balance of risks may warrant adjusting our policy stance." Following his comments, financial markets are now overwhelmingly betting on a quarter-point rate cut at the central bank's next meeting. However, Powell was careful to add a note of caution, emphasizing that monetary policy is not on a preset course. The final decision will hinge on the next round of economic data, including another jobs report and a fresh batch of inflation numbers, which are due before the Federal Open Market Committee convenes next month. A rate cut would mark a significant pivot for the Fed and would likely lead to lower borrowing costs for consumers on products like mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards.